Hello everyone, and welcome back for part 3 of my Alexander McQueen series. If you've been following along in the series, it's really good to see you again, and if you're new here, welcome. I'm Lolly. I'm glad that you're here. I make videos on fashion designers and their work, so if you like fashion and talking about fashion designers, then this is definitely the place for you. And this is actually part 3 in a series that I'm doing on Alexander McQueen, so if you haven't seen part 1 or part 2, I think that I have found a way to link them, and they should be popping up on the screen somewhere right now. If not, I tried. They're in my most recent videos. In part 1, we talked about Lee's childhood, his early career on Savile Row, attending Central St. Martin's, and the start of his own label, Alexander McQueen. In part 2, we went over his early collections that earned him the reputation of being the bad boy of British fashion. We discussed most of his work and time at Givenchy, and we left off discussing what would be his inevitable departure from Givenchy through Gucci's acquisition of his namesake label, Alexander McQueen. And in part 3, we will be discussing pretty much everything else, not everything else, but everything leading up to everything else. If that makes sense. It doesn't. We'll get into it. Oh wait, again, a little disclaimer. This video is going to be talking heavily about drug use, suicidal thoughts, suicidal tendencies, suicide, and depression. And if those are things you just aren't up for hearing about, that's totally understandable. Do feel free to come back if and when you do feel up for it. There's no pressure. I think part 2 ended with us talking about Lee's marriage to his then boyfriend Forsyth, and how in this moment of pure bliss, Lee ultimately decided that he was done. It didn't matter that the bliss wouldn't last. Lee was tired, simply exhausted from dealing with the brutish treatment he received from Bernard Arnault, LVMH, and Givenchy. He was done taking the hit for all of the bad press, for everything people had to say about him, and ultimately for the way LVMH and Givenchy treated him. So he entered serious negotiations with Gucci Group, who are now called Kering. Lee's secret meetings with Tom Ford and Domenico Desolé of Gucci Group would put into motion Lee's departure from Givenchy. Now the plan wasn't for Lee to leave Givenchy, the plan was just for Gucci Group to buy a stake in Alexander McQueen, as Lee wanted to ensure that his namesake label would have the funding it needed to survive when he did ultimately leave Givenchy at the end of his contracts in October 2001.
I was looking for major investment, and then Gucci got in touch, and the rest is history.
However, this would all go pretty horribly wrong, and we'll actually get into that in a second. But first, I want to talk about a collection that Lee made during this time, between talking to Gucci and entering negotiations with them, that I think really spoke directly to what was going on in his head at the time. Because by September 2000, no one, and I mean no one, not the press, not his family, not even his friends, had an inkling that Lee Alexander McQueen was talking with Gucci, and he wanted to keep it that way until the deal was finalized, and he distracted everyone with a collection, no, a show, that is often regarded as one of the defining collections of his career. And it isn't hard to see why. Voss was named after a Norwegian town known for its birdwatching, a show all about nature and the elements. Lee had stepped away from the glitz and glamour of the fashion industry and decided to use materials found in nature or that reflected nature. The show is said to be inspired by a walk that Lee took on a beach in Suffolk, where he came across a pile of razor clam shells, where he collected hundreds of them and then took them back to London, where he designed a long sleeveless column dress decorated in fringed shells. This led him to begin using other elements including sea pearls, feathers, and mussel shells. Another big source of inspiration for Lee would be Joel Peter Witkin's 1983 image Sanitarium, which depicted a naked woman wearing a head mask with mercury-like wings on her ears, reclining in a classical pose and breathing through a glass tube that was attached to the mouth of a monkey that was strung up on the back wall.
When I was collecting Witkins, I was going through some sinister times with sex and, all this finding about yourself.
This photo will make more sense at the end of the show, so let's just jump right in. Before the show even started, Lee had the audience seated around a giant mirrored cube that forced them to look at themselves for hours on end. Lee told the press in this collection the idea was to turn people's faces on themselves. I wanted to turn it around and make them think, am I actually as good as what I'm looking at?
Life isn't perfect, and we're not all perfect. We're not all size 0 models, and but there is beauty within the eye of the beholder.
So photographers, fashion critics, fashion editors alike, everyone was forced to stare at themselves for hours and hours.
We were all sitting there looking at ourselves, and nobody, especially at the end of the day after weeks of fashion shows, wants to look at themselves. Everyone was already discomforted.
As we, the audience, were waiting for the show to begin, we were confronted with a reflection of ourselves, which was very discomforting. It was a parable about fashion.
Until just before the show began and the room finally went dark, and the mirrored cube lit up to reveal a waiting room with padded walls and a white tiled floor. It was a mental hospital holding room, and in the middle of the room was a box with rust-stained walls. Lee had designed this cube so that the audience could now see in, but the models couldn't see out. They could now only see themselves. And that is why Lee told the models backstage, "You're in an asylum. I need you to go mental, have a nervous breakdown, die, and then come back to life."
But that was quite an extraordinary show because usually, especially with the McQueen show, you really feed off the lights, you feed off the music and the audience. And this was a very strange show to be a part of because you essentially just went into a very bright white room and all you could see was yourself. You know, you felt quite insane.
Model Aaron O'Connor said the unanimous explanation among all the models who worked with him was that he actually gave you freedom of expression, which allowed them to get on his stages and catwalks and be more than just a pretty face. And Voss was no different. The models didn't know who was out there. They had no idea who was watching them. And in that moment, they were free. They were free to do anything that they wanted, be as crazy as they wanted. And that showed. Kate Moss opened the show with her head wrapped in white gauze bandages, looking like she had just undergone electroshock therapy. She stumbled around the room, feeling her way along the mirrors as if trying to find a way out. It felt claustrophobic, as well as a commentary on the scrutiny many models in the industry face. The models that followed wore similar bandages and flailed around wearing some of the most beautiful clothes anyone had ever seen. Karen Elson sauntered out in a Japanese kimono from the 19th century that had come from a silkscreen Lee had found in Paris and had shipped back to London, where he and Sarah Burton delicately sliced off the fabric, fused it to cotton, and then he hand-sewed it into a kimono with a matching hat that he topped off with a real amaranth plant, a plant that is described as immortal because of its ability to retain its bright colors and not wilt even when dying. Another model stumbled out in a dress made of hawk feathers with real taxidermy hawks attached to her head and shoulders, which made it appear as though the birds were circling and waiting to attack her, sort of like the movie The Birds. And that made the model move nervously throughout the stage, anticipating an attack from these hawks.
I remember Kate Moss and Lee standing together just before I went on going, "Go on, Jay, go on," which I think just wound me up even more. You know, so I sort of go out and I am sort of slightly freaking out. And I genuinely am quite freaking out at this point because I'm so sort of nervous and overexcited. And you've got to be up for the challenge.
The show also had some gothic theatrical elements to it, including a dress with a mini castle and a top made of jigsaw puzzles. Then Erin O'Connor stumbled out in the razor clam dress, and just as she moved through the room, the lights dimmed and she began running her hands through the dress, tearing off shells and throwing them on the floor. Symbolically, it felt as though she was shedding layers or weight one might feel with anxiety or in an act of self-acceptance. Obviously, Erin O'Connor ruined the dress, but she did so at Lee's request, with Lee telling her that the shells had already outlived their usefulness on the beach, and he had given them new life on the dress. So when she thrashed around and ultimately broke the shells, they became useless once more.
So I go out, and just before, he sort of grabs me by the clam, and he says, "I want you to rip the dress off." And I just think, "Are you sure?" Yeah, it'll be really in the moment. I just want you to just tear it off and just have this breakdown and so all of a sudden I did exactly as I was told. I was stripping away the pain and the armour and just going, "Here I am," you know, and it was so dramatic.
Terrifyingly dangerous, and I actually fell in that and cut my neck.
Did you?
Yeah.
Because
massively so. It was, I'm thinking, well, how on earth am I going to make this? You know, I'm literally walking on my tiptoes.
It was a commentary on how Lee saw fashion, and it is an image branded in people's minds because in that moment, Erin O'Connor depicted the powerful and strong image of the McQueen woman. And to continue on with this theme of empowerment, there was an engraved crimson red Venetian glass corset that was said to symbolize the delicate nature of our mental health. And then for the finale, Erin O'Connor came out again, this time in a dress covered in blood-red stained microscope slides that took Lee over a month and a half to construct, as the skirt had to be made like 18th century crinoline in order to keep its shape and withstand the weight of the top. So that meant that everything had to be sewn by hand. The exterior of the skirt was made completely of ostrich feathers that ombrayed from ruby red to black. But the true moment of transcendence, the moment it became a McQueen show, was the finale when the lights went down and the sound of a beeping heart monitor amplified throughout the room, just before all the lights turned back on and the rust-stained walls of the box that sat in the middle of the room came crashing to the floor. Inside was writer Michelle O'Lee lounging naked on an antique chaise lounge chair, wearing a winged head mask and breathing through a glass tube that had been enveloped by a cloud of moths, directly mirroring Joel Peter Witkin's 1983 image, Sanitarium.
When it opened up at the end and you saw this woman there and you saw the moths flying around, it really was incredibly distressing, disturbing, a feeling that there was something inside his head and his mind that you didn't want to know about.
The show was nothing short of monumental and one of the defining shows of his career. To those in attendance, they knew they had witnessed greatness.
But then, you know, again, Lee McQueen, we laughed it off within 2 minutes, and I was like, if I'm walking out there again for the finale, you are holding on to me. And he held so tenderly onto me and made sure that I didn't fall again.
And as the positive reviews rolled in and the world spun, Lee only had one thing to say to the press: I'm bored of trying. Bored of being an anarchist with these big companies. It gets to a point where it means nothing. If I were God, I would stop fashion for 5 years. And then he went straight back into negotiations with Gucci. These meetings were said to have put a lot of pressure on Lee, with him saying it was a major deal. I wanted to get it signed quick because of the stress it was causing, as he was starting to experience panic attacks and was too scared to leave his home, fearful of what would happen if LVMH or the press caught on before he had a chance to finalize everything. He became so paranoid that he started avoiding Givenchy executives and canceling meetings with LVMH to avoid saying the wrong thing or have them question him. And actually, it was said that there was a point where Lee went to one of the Givenchy executives that he was close to and pretty much inferred that he was going to be bought out by Gucci. And they thought he was joking. They didn't take him too seriously. And basically around the time that the deal was about to be finalized is when they started to really kind of look into it, and that made them panic. But by that point, it was too late. On December 2nd, 2000, Gucci and McQueen closed their deal. On December 3rd, 2000, Gucci issued a press release announcing their 51% acquisition in Alexander McQueen, in a deal reportedly worth $425 million. The contract stated that Lee would maintain full creative control over Alexander McQueen, while Gucci took over manufacturing his work, building up storefronts, and launching a tailoring line and a menswear line. The contracts also stipulated that Lee's contract with Gucci Group would become exclusive upon the expiration of his contracts with LVMH and Givenchy in October 2001. LVMH quickly responded to Gucci's press release saying, "We view it as a somewhat desperate attempt to gain headlines." They also said Lee first went to LVMH for investment in his label, but they ultimately decided it didn't make commercial sense to buy into Alexander McQueen, and it was only right that Lee should seek financing for his tiny business, as he was always complaining about something, further saying the only reason they never fired him was because they were too polite. Which is just a ridiculous thing to say. Domenico Desolé and Tom Ford of Gucci Group felt the same way, and they responded to LVMH's statement calling it nonsense, because LVMH was never given the option by Lee to ever make an investment in Alexander McQueen. Lee even had to come out publicly and explain, "When I first signed a contract with LVMH, who owned Givenchy, I was also presented with a contract whereby LVMH would buy my company. But I said no, and we went ahead for 4.5 years with their men constantly hounding me about buying McQueen." Thankfully, he never signed his company rights away, because they probably would have just locked him out of his house like they do to so many others. And I'm sure Lee was grateful that he never agreed to anything, because he described his experience at Givenchy as worse than being a gladiator.
I mean, I was 26 when I went to Paris, and I'd only been out of college like 2 years, and I know I was the head of French couture house, and it was like thrown to the lions. And the only person who was feeling it was from me. And there's like, I had on one hand, I had people were saying I was a misogynist for my own label, and on the other hand, people were saying I didn't understand couture. So what was people giving me? They weren't giving me no leeway. Even if sometimes I wouldn't like to think so, my work does run into my life. So there has to be some sort of peace and calm there. And yeah, I think, I'm very fond of Domenico and Tom. And I'm very...
They let you very free?
Completely, 100% artistic control over my company and over the illusion of Alexander McQueen and the shops, which is the main reason why I chose Gucci Group over LVMH, because of the freedom. I think, no disrespect to Monsieur Arnaud, but the different mentality, a different concept in business. But my feeling was more of a family-orientated company, more relaxed and less pressurized, and I'm happy with where I am now.
Despite the public battle happening between LVMH and Gucci Group, Lee really didn't want any part of it. He just wanted to put his head down and get back to work. He had about 10 months left on his contracts. It was December 2000. His contracts ended in October 2001. And he had a couture show with Givenchy lined up for January that he kind of just wanted to and needed to get to work on. So when LVMH and Gucci started going at it, Lee said that Givenchy executives started interfering even more. And it drove him to a point where he basically tried to give them an out. He went to executives and said, I asked to leave in January, and they said, no, we can't let you leave. And I said, well, in that case, you're just going to let me do my fucking job. I'm here and will stay here till the end of my contract, but I'm taking control of it from now on. Otherwise, it's going to be the worst year. Fire me, because that's what I wanted anyway. And they would fire him, but not yet. I think they were playing the long game, and I think they wanted to intentionally and publicly, hurt him and embarrass him. But Lee would sort of get the jump on them. We'll talk about it in a second. But they would intentionally hurt him one final time. So Lee basically went back to work on his January couture show that was based on a trip that he took to Kenya. And originally the show was going to be staged at the Palais Omnisport de Paris-Bercy Stadium. I know I totally butchered that, but basically it's at the stadium. And at the last second, LVMH canceled that show and decided to hold a private in-person presentation with no press or photographers present. The official reason for the sudden change was that seamstresses were on strike and there just wasn't enough staff available to complete the show. But the real reason was said to have been a directive from above, presumably by Bernard Arnault, to punish Lee for his defection to Gucci Group. By this point, it was glaringly obvious that Givenchy was going to fire Lee. In an interview he did a few years later, an interviewer asked him if he knew he was going to be fired, and Lee responded, "Oh God, yes, I already knew. Why do you think I didn't walk the whole length?" He is talking about the fact that after this show, it was said that instead of walking the entire catwalk, he pretty much just walked out, made a very brief appearance, turned back, and left. And to spite them one final time, Lee put out one final Alexander McQueen show that wasn't under Gucci Group that I think really pushed the message. That Lee Alexander McQueen hated Bernard Arnault and LVMH with his entire heart and soul. Despite the fact that Lee knew he was going to be fired, probably publicly by LVMH, he was angry. He was angry how things were ending seemingly so insultingly with Givenchy, so he put everything he had into his next McQueen show, a collection that alluded to his anger at Bernard Arnault and LVMH. With Lee saying, when I design, whatever is happening in my personal life comes out in my work, and some of Lee's best work is created from his anger and pain.
Sadly, in my work itself, I think everything I do is personal. If you want to know me, just look at my work.
With him saying there's beauty in anger. Anger for me is a passion. If you don't have passion for something, you shouldn't be doing it in the first place. How can you move something forward if you are not confrontational? There comes a point where you just have to block off commercialism and do it from the heart. And What a Merry-Go-Round was just that. It had references and nods to Nosferatu, Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, and the dark and ugly side of childhood. It was almost as though Lee wanted to show that nothing is as golden as it seems, which could also be a reference back to the first show he ever did for Givenchy, which was Jason and the Argonauts, where everything was white and gold. However, Lee said the show was inspired by Marianne of the painting Liberty Leading the People by Eugene Delacroix, whose image became the symbol of liberty during the Revolution. It was almost like Lee's way of describing his own newfound freedom, this time from France. What a Merry-Go-Round opened in complete darkness to the voice of the child catcher from Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, offering free candy and ice cream to village children so he could catch them and lock them in a dungeon. It was almost like Lee's way of describing how he saw LVMH and Bernard Arnault, and how they would go around offering money and backing only to imprison you and make you fear for your career. It was a bold and confronting statement. The first portion of the show was fast-paced. The models came out with Marcel waves. They walked around an antique carousel wearing patent leather jackets, overcoats, leather skirts, and pants. And then out came a Dior Galliano-esque beaded sheer dress that was paired with a plastic Halloween pirate's helmet. It felt like Lee's way of making fun at John Galliano, who was known for his sheer beaded dresses, as well as his very costumey theatrical pieces. And then to dig the knife a little deeper or make his message even clearer to the press. Towards the end of the show, the music slowed down, and the curtains fell to reveal an eerie stage backdrop of gigantic stuffed animals, discarded dolls, puppets, and various circus items. That is when models emerged in tricorn wigs, with white face makeup on, looking like circus freaks. All of these models came out in Dior Galliano-esque bias-cut gowns and ruffled asymmetric suits. One of these models in particular came out with a golden skeleton attached to her ankle as she walked. It was said to be the exact same skeleton from Lee's Dante show. The entire thing was a huge FU to LVMH, Bernard Arnault, and their beloved John Galliano. A snub to all things LVMH loved, which was John Galliano, and Lee was calling them a joke, showing them how he sees them, how the world sees them, and just what he thinks of them. Because up until this point, Lee's career had been compared to that of John Galliano by the press and fashion editors alike. They had very similar career paths, they both graduated Central St. Martin's, and both were known for putting on some very theatrical shows, but they were very, very different. While John Galliano mostly took inspiration from everyone else, including copying most of Vivienne Westwood's career, Lee's inspirations came from within. And I'm not going to argue about John Galliano here, that's probably for a different video. Dude is talented, but he definitely copied pretty much all of Vivienne Westwood's career. And Lee's ego and competitiveness couldn't allow him to be compared to John Galliano, so throughout his career he tried to emulate and outdo him by remaking his designs, and this show was no different. Lee was telling LVMH and the press that he could do everything John Galliano did. He was just as talented, but unlike John Galliano, he wasn't going to let them run him into the ground. It was a very bold and confronting statement. It was his last show outside of Gucci Group, and the last collection he made while still working under Givenchy. Soon after this, it was announced that Alexander McQueen would not be returning to Givenchy. Bernard Arnault could not allow Lee to continue working at Givenchy after he signed his company over to his rivals at Gucci Group, and especially not after that show. Bernard Arnault could not allow the blatant joke being made at their expense by Lee, and Lee knew this was inevitable. He knew he was going to be fired months ago, so I think he just figured, what's the worst that could happen? What's the worst they could do to me now? And the answer was nothing. They didn't control him anymore. They had no say over how he spoke, who he spoke to, who he hung out with, or the work that he put out. LVMH couldn't touch him. He was free. I think. And on a funny note, Julia McDonald, who we talked about briefly in part 2.
Clothes are clothes at the end of the day. They're meant to be worn. And, nobody wants to look like an 18th century, tablecloth. And nobody wants to wear money around their head. People want clothes.
Would actually take over Lee's position at Givenchy.
He is not a tailor. He's a knitwear designer. Like, those puddings you have with sugar, the spun sugar? It's like that. He's a sort of fairy tale kind of Welsh fantasy knitwear designer, but he isn't a technician of the silhouette.
And here's what he had to say about his experience there. They never helped us. They never did anything, never gave us any advice. You were on your own. He said that his first few days there were a nightmare, with executives asking him to create a pre-fall collection, even though he had never done one before and had no idea what a pre-fall collection was. And no one there bothered to explain or even help him. So he went to his office, which was Lee's old office, had a nice little scream, and then called Lee to ask what a pre-fall collection was. His schedule was equally inhumane, but unlike Lee, he wasn't designing for 2 houses, and yet he was there all day, every day, saying nobody can prepare you for the amount of work and pressure it takes. It makes you mad. It was a torturous 3 years of having 0 life. You constantly have to pull it off. Myself and Lee, we were too young and inexperienced. I guess they should have believed Lee. And this isn't all some made-up conspiracy or way to hate on LVMH, though they do support Donald Trump, and I think that speaks volumes today to who they are as people. This is all true. Everyone should have listened to Lee. Instead, they chose to make him seem crazy and that he was acting like a brat, when in reality he was braver than most. Unlike John Galliano and Julian McDonald, who took hit after hit from LVMH, Lee defied LVMH, and that in and of itself was brave. I'm sure he didn't feel brave, but he was. And like I said before, he was free. This marked the end of his 4.5 years at Givenchy, with him saying, "It was like having a boyfriend that you know you have to break up with. The only difference with this relationship was that I didn't feel bad about doing it." Further saying, "It's like that was the mentality I had to deal with. I felt totally isolated. I thought, what am I doing working my fucking ass off for this company? It still drives me mad thinking about it, but it's fine. Maybe I'll change the way LVMH thinks. Maybe they'll start to treat people a bit more like human beings." And thus what began as an exciting and hopeful venture ended in a complete mess. Today, Lee's work at Givenchy is revered for its complexities and beauty, but during his time there it went mostly unappreciated. And the only thing Lee took away from his time there was the work he learned from the atelier, with him saying, "Because I was a tailor, I didn't totally understand softness or lightness. I learned lightness at Givenchy. I was a tailor at Savile Row. At Givenchy, I learned to soften. For me, it was an education. As a designer, I could have left it behind, but working at Givenchy helped me learn my craft."
It's quite heart-wrenching, not heart, it's heartwarming to see these pieces. I mean, I don't know how I did his shoulders.
Yeah.
Feel the pad. It's like...
Oh, yes.
And he took that knowledge and he used it in every single McQueen collection he made thereafter. From here on, Lee was making more grown-up decisions for Alexander McQueen. His focus was on the longevity of the House of McQueen by building up his own name and legacy. And for the first time, he felt that was possible. Things were really coming together. But the question we have to ask ourselves in every video of this series, and pretty much any time we talk about Alexander McQueen, is, was any of it worth it? Because the answer is usually no. From the outside, Alexander McQueen was thriving. He had just signed a $425 million deal with Gucci. He had surgery to lose weight, he had his teeth fixed, he traded in his grubby and ragged jeans and t-shirts for slim, sleek suits. But the truth was, Lee's drug use was so bad by this point, I really don't want to talk about this. But the jobs, the pressure, the critics, and the stress of the last few years seemed to really push him over the edge, to the point where it was said by many close to him that Lee had overdosed on multiple occasions and had to be given Narcan just to come to. The constant work, travel, and pressures of the industry seemed to only exacerbate his drug use. His husband at the time said the fashion world is the loneliest place on the face of the planet. It's a shallow world full of party people and party friends. Lee knew that. Lee even told Forsyth that he had a public persona as Alexander, the bad boy of fashion, and Lee. But by this point, Lee had lost almost all of his close friends, and those that were there for Alexander didn't genuinely care about his well-being. His escalating mood swings were shrugged off as mere eccentricity, when they probably were a cry for help. By this point, Lee was lost. He was putting on a front in public, but he was trying to get back to the things he loved most. With Lee saying, "I do these really complex showpieces to push myself. I have to keep myself on the edge, and I wonder was it worth it? I feel abused, yes, but then that's what I'm about. I wouldn't do it any other way." Further saying, "I don't need any more money in my life. I'm in fashion because I love it. I needed to find a way to get that love back." And his next 2 collections, The Dance of the Twisted Bull and Supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, seemed to prove just that. But as always, Lee needed to put himself back into the work. And in October 2002, he created a collection that spoke to who he was. Iraire, or Ireri, was a show that focused on water, a place where Lee always felt the most at peace. Iraire is said to be an indigenous Amazonian word to mean transformation, and so Lee's show was inspired by the age of exploration as well as the Amazon rainforest. Iraire was a story of one girl's metamorphosis from shipwreck survivor to Amazon princess, hence why just before the show the audience watched a short film of a girl seemingly drowning in the ocean while her chiffon gown floated around her like jellyfish. The set was a Blair Witch-style haunted forest, and what unfolded was a sartorial narrative of pirates, conquistadors, and maidens who were left shipwrecked in the Amazon rainforest. They wore frock coats decorated with koi carp that were based on one of Lee's tattoos. As well as the oyster dress, a beige chiffon gown with a skirt that resembled an oyster shell. It was said to be so technically complex to make that Sarah Burton recalls Lee's construction of the piece by saying, "He wanted this idea of it was almost like she drowned, and the top part of the dress is all fine boning and tulle, and the chiffon is all frayed and disheveled on the top. The skirt is made out of hundreds of circles of organza. Then with a pen what Lee did was he drew organic lines, and then all these circles were cut, joined together, and then applied in these lines along the skirt. So you created this organic oyster-like effect. It was reported to have cost around £45,000 to create, and was a masterful reinterpretation of John Galliano's 1987 shellfish dress that Lee had spent years admiring and had finally recreated. While the second half of the show was a crescendo of color, again following the story of being shipwrecked, discovering land, and exploring the Amazon. This portion of the show was inspired by the colorful aspects of the Amazon, which included the feathers of the red macaw and the costumes of the Wayway tribespeople. Iraire was a story about being lost and then found, exploring the intimate side of Lee's life. Lee McQueen, who swam with sharks to get away from mankind, who read National Geographic and spent his downtime reading history books. While critics felt the collection was beautiful, they also thought it was a letdown. They wanted him to push boundaries. Every show, every season needed to be bigger and better, and Iraire left them wondering where the rawness went, and if the anarchy was gone. And this was always the biggest contention of Lee's career, this balance between the theatrics and commercialism. The public wanted the theatrics, but they also wanted more commercial pieces, and that is something that John Galliano did and does really well. He has an ability to balance his theatrics with commercial work. What you see on his runways is usually what you see off the runway, which wasn't necessarily true for McQueen's work. Usually what you saw on the runway didn't translate into the store, and the press really ate him up for this. And it messed with his head because he had time and time again put himself into his collections, giving himself away to people who didn't value him, and it left him feeling abused and exposed to people who didn't see the bigger picture. And it didn't help that around this time, Lee was actually getting a divorce from his husband Forsyth. So to kind of get away from everything, in summer 2003, Lee reconnected with Sebastian Pons, who he hadn't spoken to since their falling out 3 years prior, and it was during that trip that Lee confided his worst nightmare. He had contracted HIV. The news was said to have shocked Sebastian Pons, but Lee reassured him that he was taking his meds and doing everything he could to remain healthy. But it seems that Lee had been sitting on this news for months, afraid to confront it, keeping his diagnosis a secret because of the shame that came with the stereotypical taboos of the disease, and it seemed to have cast a darkness over him. To feel your death is imminent, to live not knowing how long you have, seems to be unimaginable, and yet Lee persisted for a few years, but this would all come crashing down on him eventually. In an interview he did in 2004, Lee told the press him actually thinking of leaving fashion.
What do you see yourself in, let's say, 5 years from now?
Not doing fashion. Something I enjoy. Yeah, you have one life. I don't see the point in doing the same thing for the rest of it. I've got other things on my mind. You know, I just want to be happy in what I'm doing, and fashion's so limited, really. So, 5 years is a long way away. Fashion moves so fast. 5 years is like 50 years.
And this is a thought that Lee battled pretty much his whole career. We talked about it in part 1, we talked about it in part 2, we're talking about it now in part 3, and we will continue to talk about it in part 4. Because Lee always wanted to get out, but he never did. Or maybe he couldn't. And it's crazy to think he was going through all of this and yet somehow managed to give such a heartfelt McQueen show that October. It seems like he poured everything he had into Deliverance. Deliverance was a masterpiece, not just for the clothes, but for the show itself. Inspired by the 1969 film They Shoot Horses, Don't They?, about Depression-era characters in a month-long dance marathon. Lee's show depicted the themes of expectation and exhaustion. Lee's entire childhood, he suffered physical, sexual, and mental abuse, and though he was now older and theoretically free, he was still being held down by others' expectations of him. And he was simply exhausted. And Deliverance showed that. Deliverance was set up in an old boxing hall with an MC who started the show by announcing the competition of a half-dozen couples, a mix of professional dancers and models, and because they had to dance, Lee's usual straight tailoring was abandoned for a more relaxed fit. The women entered the dance in the arms of sailors dressed in figure-hugging dresses and gowns, and then the music amped up, and the couples picked up their pace, switching from the tango to the rumba to the foxtrot. After 10 minutes, the lights went down, and the second half of the show started. Out came models in daywear, and soon after they were grabbing their partners and running arm in arm in a large oval as if they were on a racetrack. They ran, and they ran. Pushing at each other and pushing at each other until they were panting and exhausted and had collapsed into a giant heap. For the finale, the dance marathon finalists came out, now all visibly exhausted and disheveled. They flailed about madly as their partners were now holding them up or dragging them off into the darkness.
You know, I was like, yeah, let's pretend that I'm exhausted and delirious. And it was, you know, profoundly beautiful. I mean, I can't tell you, it was honestly my favorite ever fashion show experience.
Yeah,
and all things with Lee. I mean, just
incredibly beautiful.
It's just so beautiful. That's what fashion shows can be, you know?
I've always wanted to incorporate movement into the clothes, some form of emotion through movement of dance. And I'd watched this film by accident about 8 months ago, and it was emotional. And he had all the feelings of the McQueen show, the sadness, the happiness, the desperation, and it seemed quite relevant to what was going on in the world today. On a design level, the clothes are much more feminine than they've ever been.
Eventually, only one remained, a lone dancer in a silver lame column dress, who continued dancing until she fell to the floor in a lifeless mess. It was like watching a live theater performance during Fashion Week. It was said to be breathtaking and beautiful. And only a few weeks later, Lee put on his family's Scottish Highland dress and escorted his parents to Buckingham Palace to receive the decoration of Commander of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire from Queen Elizabeth. Lee only accepted the award at his mother's request because he didn't actually want to go at all. Lee hated rich people. He hated people who flaunted their wealth, people who acted and felt like they were untouchable. And it didn't matter if you were quite literally the Queen of England. With Lee saying there is no style in gloating about money, these silly cows who gloat about it in the press, it makes me quite sick. And that is why there are many, many instances throughout his career where he refused to dress people like Victoria Beckham and Paris Hilton. He loathed conspicuous consumption. In 1997, he refused to dress Mwanda Al-Ayoub, the former wife of Saudi billionaire Nasir al-Rashid, for the way she flaunted her wealth. And it was reported that when Courtney Love tried to walk out of one of his showrooms with 40,000 pounds worth of clothes, he told his team to bill her. And in 2006, when Lee saw Victoria Beckham wearing one of his tartan skirts, he sent word to his team that she wasn't allowed any more freebies because he didn't accept her as a fashion designer. He didn't care how big a celebrity you were. It simply didn't matter to him. But Lee would come to treasure that award from Queen Elizabeth and found himself proud to have been able to have stood at Buckingham Palace with his parents at his side. And this right here is another perfect example of another battle that Lee had all throughout his life. And that was the battle between Lee McQueen and Alexander McQueen. On one hand, there was Lee McQueen, who grew up in East London, who had a foul mouth, had a mohawk, and bad teeth, who had this incredible talent, but was painstakingly shy, and didn't feel as though he belonged in the fashion world. The boy whose father begged him to get a real job.
If you can imagine, he's come from nothing to have all that wealth. But at the same time, it must have been under such a lot of pressure from the different people around him to produce new clothes, new collections all the time.
And then there was Alexander McQueen, the bad boy of British fashion, who lost weight, who got his teeth fixed, and wore nice suits, someone the press loved, who seemingly belonged in the world of fashion. And Lee was never able to find a balance between the two of them. But both men stood at Buckingham Palace that day and received that award. But only one of them felt like they deserved it, and only one of them felt like they belonged.
I don't want to be stuck in that bubble of this is what I do, because it's nice because you see everyone in the office, they go home and they can shut off. But I'm still like Alexander McQueen after I shut the door. Do you know what I mean? I've got to go home with myself. So, and, you know, if you've had a bad day, I've only got myself to answer to. So.
And it's so weird, but that exact same day, it was announced that Tom Ford and Domenico Desolé would be leaving Gucci upon the expiration of their contracts in April 2004. And it was rumored that Henri Pinault of Gucci actually offered the role of creative director of Saint Laurent to Lee, but he turned it down, saying, "When I was at Givenchy, I ended up designing 14 collections a year, including stuff for my own house. It frazzled my mind. I'm never going back to that." But there were also rumors that Lee almost took the offer, but he wanted the ads to say YSL by Alexander McQueen, and Gucci refused.
Sad. No comment.
Just like Bernard Arnault, Henri Pinault of Gucci Group didn't want another designer with a face and name. They just wanted a designer, someone they could control. They didn't need strong personalities like Tom Ford and Alexander McQueen, who had long established themselves as stars. Houses like Givenchy, Dior, Louis Vuitton, and Gucci could now stand on their own because they didn't need Alexander McQueen, John Galliano, Marc Jacobs, or Tom Ford anymore. Those men had done all the hard work building up these brands, and now these conglomerates just needed someone to churn out work. And this was, and is, always the problem. Businessmen who know nothing about fashion, but everything about growth. By getting rid of Tom Ford and Domenico Desolé, it allowed Gucci to refocus all of the house's strategies. And for Alexander McQueen, that meant within 2 years, they had launched eyewear, menswear, accessories, and fragrances. Even if they had no connection to Alexander McQueen, or his life, or his story, or his house, it was all about money. They also had Lee collaborate with Puma and Samsonite. This nauseating growth, mixed with the loss of freedom Lee once enjoyed under Gucci's leadership, started to feel constraining. It started to feel exactly like it had at Givenchy. Lee was working non-stop and attending mandatory parties just to show face and then leave. He was also showing obvious signs of disenchantment with the job, the work, and the bureaucratic moguls of the fashion industry. With Lee saying, "I've never aspired to mass produce because of my training as a tailor. My work involved lots of love and care, which is why so many of my clothes are made by hand here in London."
I've always, you know, to make me very sort of like interested in a show, I have to do lots of hand work. I have to see, because when you manufacture garments like you do in Italy, you can't really see the process. And I need to see the process. I need to see the patterns develop. I need to see, I just need to be more hands-on with my work, you know. I need to have that feeling and that passion for why I do fashion. All the people here are students, and it's like training them up and giving them that initial step into the world of fashion, especially when it comes to a show, because everyone who comes from colleges or universities that works here, they all come to Paris, so they see it from the start to the end. So it's almost like a mini university for students. This is why design or fashion is so expensive because of what goes into the garments. You know, it's not just about printing something. This is like meticulously like engineered around the body. You can't. The high street can't do this because they can't afford to do this. This is what we do, and this is why we do it, because it brings fashion to another level.
Yes.
I don't believe in can't or cannot. I think everything's possible, and we'll strive until fingers bleed.
And maybe that's what inspired his next show. Lee channeled his frustrations, his love of the work and craftsmanship into his next show, It's Only a Game, a show based on the 1975 film Picnic at Hanging Rock, about a girls' boarding school in Australia whose strict headmistress takes 5 girls to a picnic at Hanging Rock, only for the girls to disappear. The show was staged on a giant chessboard said to be inspired by the game in Harry Potter, and the models all lined up like chess pieces. The chess device allowed Lee to recreate some of his greatest hits, and by the time the 36 models took their positions on the board, you could see all of Lee's signatures and silhouettes. The show was dedicated to himself, a summation of his experiences at Savile Row, with Koji Tatsuno, Romeo Gigli, and at Givenchy. The looks were modernized, which made them even more desirable and commercial, but they lacked the punk rawness of his early McQueen work. And it had critics wondering if Lee was maturing, if he was getting older, if he was getting tired of being so anti-establishment, or if he was just simply tired.
Before, like years ago, it was, mainly about the shock tactics of the show to grab the attention of the press, make some form of statement. Today, it's more theoretically thought out. The collection and the time. My mind is constantly working overtime to come up with a concise and directional collection that is fundamentally sellable.
Tell a joke.
Me.
See, life was hard, and it wasn't just hard for Lee. By the end of 2003, Isabella Blow was spiraling. Both Philip Treacy and Lee were very concerned for Isabella Blow's mental state, as it was said that she was missing flights while sitting in the airport terminals. It was also said that while having lunch with a Prada executive, she took her boobs out and put them on the table. And it was also said that upon arriving at a fashion show, somehow her underwear had fallen down while she was walking to her seat, and she simply stepped out of them and kept walking. It was all very bizarre behavior, and no one knew what to do for her. But as we discussed in part 2, Lee and Isabella's friendship by this point had waned. Lee had felt suffocated by Isabella Blow, who felt she was owed something for Lee's career. Lee's ex-boyfriend Andrew Grove said their relationship was odd because Isabella Blow would do everything for Lee, because as long as she was in a position to help him, she knew she could control the relationship. But the more successful Lee became, the more nervous it made her. Fearing that she would lose him, she started to act out, disrupting the workspace of his staff in the studio, and going backstage at his shows and demanding having her hair and makeup done. She would also call McQueen headquarters non-stop, demanding free clothes and pieces to loan that she would just never return. Philip Treacy said, "We used to say that the press office at McQueen deserves a medal because of the way Isabella Blow treated the McQueen team and because of the way she acted." And it wasn't just Lee that she was acting out with. She also got mad at Philip Treacy, who she felt didn't do enough for her. Because around this time, I guess Philip Treacy had written a book about his career, and it was said that he failed to mention her in that book. And her anger actually upset Philip Treacy because he absolutely adored her, and he raved about her all the time to the press. Everyone was worried for her, but no one knew what to do for her. And Lee really wanted no part of it because, again, he felt betrayed by Isabella Blow. He also felt suffocated because nothing he did for her seemed to be enough. Isabella's husband Detmar said Izzy feared that all these people she introduced to McQueen would take his love away from her, and it led her to believe that Lee's close-knit McQueen team hated her, with Isabella Blow saying, "Everyone gets frustrated and annoyed with me in the office. I'm sure they find me a complete pain." And Lee couldn't handle this. Nothing was good enough. She wanted all of his time, his attention, his love, his clothes, and his money. By this point, Isabella Blow had become obsessed with money. Everything had come back to money and her perceived lack of it, what she saw as an ingratitude from those she had helped. She complained to Lee that she was poor, and Lee didn't want to hear it, and he didn't feel bad for her because he had actually been poor his whole life. The dude literally ate a McDonald's meal that he bought that had fallen on the floor because he couldn't afford to buy another meal. And he simply didn't have sympathy for Isabella Blow because she did actually have money. She just didn't have the money to live the lifestyle that she wanted. She didn't have the money to be in the social class that she wanted to be in. And when she did get money, she spent it frivolously.
God, it's stressful. You're here one day, you're gone the next, you bump into people all the time, you know what I mean? You're all, but it's a very tiny little world.
And in a moment of anger, she went to the press yet again and told them, he's become a millionaire. He's got it all stashed away. His house is piled with stuff. Everything is money. Rightfully so, Lee was pissed, saying she's like a disease, a terminal disease. Everything she does rubs off on you.
Oh, Kim. She's my idol. Thank you.
Because yet again, Isabella Blow had purposely turned to the people Lee hated the most. He didn't want the public or press to know anything about him. He didn't feel like he could trust her. And because of this lack of trust, they began lashing out at each other. But that's not to say that Lee didn't love her. When Philip Trucy found out that Isabella's husband Detmar was filing for divorce and she was expressing an interest in dying, Lee stepped in. He got her into a treatment program and paid for it on the condition that she remained separated from her husband, because Lee felt her relationship with him was toxic and he wanted her to get better. And for a while, everything seemed to be going great for them. But after an 18-month break, she reconciled with her husband, which strained her friendship with Lee yet again. And he had had enough. It was said that for a while he cut off contact from her, which for Isabella Blow was heartbreaking, because his clothes meant everything to her. Her access to him was everything, and that seemed to all be over now. To say there was a lot going on in Lee's life would be an understatement, which is probably why his next few collections felt a little soulless. While The Man Who Knew Too Much had a Hitchcock theme to it, it all felt very commercially and out of touch, like a Navajo-style poncho with tassels. Nothing about it felt authentic. And then there was Neptune, which was equally beautiful, stunning even. There's metalwork and plunging necklines. But the man who once took delight in scaring and designing on the brink of scandal seemed to be lost. Nothing about these two collections screamed Lee. Nothing connected to his life, his work, his experiences, or even his interests. Or actually, maybe it did speak to his life, to the fact that he had a lot going on, and he wasn't handling it well. The biggest highlight of Neptune was Lee's walkout at the end, when he came out in a t-shirt that read, "We love you, Kate," in support of Kate Moss, who had just lost several contracts after the paparazzi had filmed her taking drugs. Designers like Karl Lagerfeld at Chanel were dropping her because the public was shaming her. It was disgusting and shameful, and odd because drug use was a known and common part of the fashion industry. It was widely accepted. The only difference is that Kate Moss got caught. So Lee came out in support of his friend because when someone has a drug problem, they shouldn't be shamed for it. Common sense and human decency are things we need a lot more of in this world. Lee knew just how the press could be, and he wasn't afraid to speak up for her. With Lee telling the press she's not the first person in fashion to do cocaine, and she won't be the last. She's done more for London fashion than anyone else. Go to the newspapers and wipe their toilets. Fucking hell, you've got Columbia on your hands. It was a very sweet gesture by Lee for his friend, and a fuck you to everyone else. Now, regarding the collection's lack of personality, Lee's friends and staff also noticed the visible difference in his work. They felt the rawness was gone. They felt Lee had become disenchanted by the work, his life, and his career. And he had also become withdrawn and started acting out. It was said that he had a room created backstage at his shows that no one was allowed into but him, essentially as though he was hiding from everyone. After the reviews of Neptune, Lee went to visit Sebastian Pons in Mallorca, where it was said that he spontaneously bought a house, just because he could. Sebastian Pons became very concerned for Lee's behavior as well as his state of mind, because Lee wasn't the same person that he knew, with Sebastian Pons saying, "He was so far away from me. I didn't know how to help him or guide him." And it seemed like Lee wanted to remain in this dreamlike state, and maybe that's why his next collection felt so magical, but also went back to what he knows best, his ancestors. And Widows of Culloden spoke to that. It appealed to innovation and ignored commercial pressures. It was inspired by the final battle of the Jacobite Risings, the Battle of Culloden. as well as the widows of Scots, who were left widowed after their husbands had died in battle. With Lee saying Scotland for me is a harsh, cold, and bitter place. It was even worse when my great-great-grandfather used to live there. The reason I'm patriotic about Scotland is because I think it's been dealt a really hard hand. The first half of the show was soft, with Lee saying this collection is romantic, but melancholic and austere at the same time. It was gentle, but you could still feel the bite of cold, the nip of the ice on the end of your nose. With bustles and nipped waists, I was interested in the idea that there are no constraints on the silhouette. I wanted to exaggerate a woman's form, almost along the lines of a classical statue. But it was the second half of the show that referred back to the only other collection Lee ever made that referenced the Battle of Culloden, and that was Highland Rape, this time without the original anger. It was far more mature. Widows of Culloden balanced out the rawness and rage of Highland Rape, and thus resulted in a poetic, technically accomplished tale of Scottish fantasy heroines wandering castles in Victorian tartan crinoline and running through the forest in bird wigs with antler headdresses on. It was a perfect ode to mark 10 years since the debut collection that earned him a reputation in fashion as a misogynist and as the bad boy of British fashion. But the real feat was at the end of the show, when inside this giant glass pyramid that sat on the stage, lit up out of the darkness, and a mysterious white puff of smoke blew out, spun around and slowly transformed into the hologram ghost of Kate Moss. Her blonde hair and arms trailed in a dreamlike apparition of fragility and beauty that danced in a cascade of organza ruffles.
The last one with Kate was poignant, not just for me, but for Kate herself. This was to take her to the atmosphere and, you know, above newspapers and the media. It was just... And it did it. It shocked her, you know. She was bigger than that.
And then dematerialized. The quality of the performance and the extraordinary workmanship only reaffirmed Lee's power as a fashion designer. And it was a complete 180 from his last few shows. Widows of Culloden showed the beauty in melancholy. And by early May, Sarah Jessica Parker would wear a dress from this collection, accompanied by Lee, to the Met Gala, the only gala he would ever attend. They walked in matching McQueen tartan for the Anglomania, Tradition and Transgression in British Fashion exhibit.
When I was invited and told the theme, I said out loud, I really wish I could go with, and we called him Lee. I wish I could go with Lee. I wish I could go with McQueen. A bunch of things came to mind, like no, he would say no. He's already been asked. He's called for. He's obliged. And I didn't really know him well enough to be so presumptuous. I summoned the courage or whatever was needed, and I reached out and I asked, would he consider attending, with me, meaning more so me with him, could I be with him that night? And he said yes.
Which we know by now is a huge deal, because Lee Alexander McQueen didn't dress just anyone, and he didn't attend public events for just anyone.
But what strikes me most about this photograph now, you can see where his shoulder ends and I begin, and there's overlap there. I guess I've seen the picture a bunch of times and I know what this is and I know what it took to for him to make this and how much he cared and all the details and everything, everything. But what strikes me about this photograph is where our heads are and how careful I'm being or cautious, or the shyer he was, the more shy I became. And I see that in this. And I'm being very careful of him. I feel like I'm literally saying are you okay? It wasn't a fun night. It was, but it wasn't, because I was so nervous. I just wanted him to be okay. He knew how I felt about him, and there was so much affection and such a deep admiration, and everybody loved him because he was such a touching person. He was a very touching person, and you were kind of in love with him. And I think I was just like everybody else. I was in love with him. I have every pin he dropped from his mouth in my possession still. I have everything he cut off in my possession still. I have things that seemed like nothing from every fitting I ever did with him, I have in my possession.
And in 2011, only 5 years after this event, the year the Met dedicated an exhibit solely to McQueen's work, Sarah Jessica Parker wore a champagne McQueen dress to the event. She said, I really loved it. Not very much like me so much, but it was McQueen, and I wanted that. There was so much thought about his contributions and his singular approach to his work, his draping skills, his cutting, all the things he did in his own way that made him so extraordinary. And Lee Alexander McQueen was extraordinary. But this wasn't the only good thing to happen in May 2006. After the Met Gala, Lee traveled to San Francisco to receive an honorary doctorate from the Academy of Art University's fashion department, where Simon Unglis worked. But the worst was yet to come. By this point, Sebastian Pons had informed Simon Unglis about Lee's diagnosis, as well as his concerns for Lee's mental state. It was also said that Sarah Burton had even informed her old teacher that 2 weeks prior to one of Lee's shows, he had just disappeared, and Burton had to pull the entire collection together alone. So knowing all of this, Simon Unglis tried to reach out to his old friend and see how he was really doing. But it was said that Lee really struggled to open up, and the pair parted ways. And it seems like this whimsical, dreamlike state that Lee was in was pretty much becoming his reality. After the trip to America, Lee got to work on his next collection, Saraband, a show that resolved the tensions between Lee's love of theatrics and commercialism. Inspired by the film Barry Lyndon, the Spanish artist Goya, and Marchesa Casati, an Italian heiress and muse to early 20th century art in Europe. The show had elements of Belle Epoque glamour with a touch of Flemish goth, and a fusion of exotic birds and the beauty of flowers. The mood was darkly romantic and yet soft. It explored the fragility and decay of beauty and life. The show really was a summation of all the things Lee loved and was obsessed with: history, birds, the macabre, and death. One of the most memorable pieces of the collection was a dress made completely of fresh flowers that fell off as the model walked, a perfect summation of the fragility of life. With Lee saying, "Remember Sam Taylor Wood's Dying Fruit? Things rot. I used flowers because they die. My mood was darkly romantic at the time," and the show was an absolute masterpiece, as was his next. Because around this time, Lee's mother Joyce began obsessing over a new discovery she had found in her ancestral line, having been able to trace her bloodline back to Elizabeth Howe, one of the victims of the Salem witch trials who had been hung during the Puritan hysteria of 1692. And Lee was equally intrigued, going as far as to visit her gravesite in Salem. Completely inspired, Lee decided to present a collection that spoke to his hatred for bigotry, as well as his love of history. He presented a heartfelt and personal collection that was an ode to his ancestors. In memory of Elizabeth Howe, Salem 1692 included themes of paganism, fertility, witchcraft, and religious persecution. The stage setup included a 45-foot inverted black pyramid suspended over a blood-red pentagram that was encircled in black sand. The show had all the elements of religious persecution, and that is why as the show began, a film reel started of a naked woman, swarming locusts, face decaying into skulls, blood and fire. He also created metal and leather bodices that were symbolic of armor, and included accessories that incorporated occult-like symbols, like a star headpiece and its companion moon headpiece that were made by Sean Lean. The moon is associated with the pagan goddess Diana, who began to appear in 17th century imagery to represent witches. The dress paired with the moon headpiece was embroidered to resemble the handwriting from surviving Salem witch trial documents. Lee even made 2 dresses that depicted the violent and demeaning ritual of shaving a guilty woman's hair prior to execution. One was in silver and the other was in gold, and the outline of these dresses was said to resemble entangled locks of hair. Lee created these dresses to reclaim this violent and brutal act taken against women. As well, there were bird claws used throughout the show to depict the panic that swept through Salem, as it was believed that the devil appeared to these women, or witches, in the form of a bird. The collection was undoubtedly a success. However, this would actually be Katie England's final McQueen show, with her saying, "There is a culture in high fashion that does not understand you needing to get home at the end of the day. My kids were little and Lee wanted me with him all the time. At that level, designers demand such loyalty, and they don't like it if you need any space from them."
I felt that I wasn't working at my best, so I needed a bit of space.
But Lee couldn't even mourn her departure, because something even worse was happening. As we discussed earlier, Isabella Blow had a very difficult last few years. Since reconciling with her husband Detmar, her friendship with Lee had been strained, and that put her in a very bad place mentally. She was also in a very harrowing place in general, but it was said that she went as far as to take attempts on her life. And I don't want to say here, and I don't want to go into detail, I don't want to glamorize any of this, but I just want to give an idea of her headspace. So there was a point where she decided that she was going to jump off an overpass, and at the last second she changed her mind, but had accidentally slipped anyway, and the fall broke both of her feet and her ankles. Despite the horrible trauma and scare to her life, it didn't seem to stop her. Friends said that if you asked her how she was doing, she would respond with, "I'm suicidal."
Yeah, you know that fake it to make it is the classic line.
Did you fake it to make it?
Well, the thing is, I can't fake it now anymore because everybody knows I've fucked up. I mean, it's going to be very difficult to fake it when you're not doing anything. People say, "How are you?" "Very well." "What are you doing?" Not much."
However, for a split second, it seemed like she was getting a grasp on reclaiming her life. In spring 2007, she invited Lee over for a weekend at her home in the hills. She organized a whole weekend, had cooks prepare meals, but when Lee arrived, he locked himself in his room. Isabella's husband said he was in bed, coked out of his head, and that was difficult for Izzy. Everything was going wrong for her, and it was sad that Alexander couldn't see that and pull himself together just a bit. Further saying McQueen was unsettled by Izzy's nervous, unconfident state, and Izzy was upset by Alexander's failure to appreciate the effort she had gone to make his weekend enjoyable. It was the last time she saw him. And I think something that we have to remember is that Lee was also in a really bad place. There was no way he was going to pull himself out of the dark hole that he was in, just like Isabella Blow couldn't. They pretty much were in the same place.
Sometimes wished he just had a normal life and that he could just be a normal person in terms of not having that pressure of everything at such a young age.
I knew Lee when he had nothing but a rubbish bin full of clothes, so I saw very quickly him become a millionaire and more. And the more money he had, he seemed to be more unhappy.
And I imagine it had to be hard on everyone who knew her and was friends with her, because by this point it seems that all she talked about was death, and how determined she was to end her own. One friend described being around her during this time like being around someone who was always slightly drunk, and the longer it went on, the harder it got. Anna Wintour said there was this saddening inevitability about what was going to happen. She decided to embark on the journey, and she had every intention of taking it. Further saying the best thing you could do was listen. It didn't make sense from the outside, but that's the illness. And by early May, Isabella Blow had planned an entire weekend for all of her friends at her home in the hills. She even invited Lee and asked him to make her a special outfit for the weekend. But Lee would neither make her an outfit nor attend the event. That weekend, on May 5th, she told her friends she was going to the store, and instead she went into her garden shed and drank weed killer. Thankfully, she was able to call her friends and tell them what she had done, but by the time they had found her, she was unconscious. So they called an ambulance, and by the time she arrived at the ICU, she was conscious again. But doctors had informed her that there was nothing they could do for her. She would remain awake and responsive until her body inevitably shut down. During her final days, she talked to friends and family, but not Lee, with Susie Mankey saying, "Izzy did sound very alone, and felt disappointed that Lee had let her down, and that he had not given her any support." She passed away May 7, 2007 at the age of 48, and when Lee heard the news, it was said that he became inconsolable. He was able to choose her burial outfit, and he was even given a lock of her hair, with the intention of having Sean Lean burn it into Victorian mourning rings. He also attended her service in traditional Highland dress. But many of Isabella Blow's close friends were left angry at Lee's attendance at her service, angered that he didn't attend her weekend at Hills, where she tried to and ultimately ended up killing herself, which is a really odd thing to be angry at. You'd almost want to be relieved that more people weren't there to witness it. But it was also said that they were even angrier that he had never visited her at the hospital, which I think I remember reading somewhere that Isabella Blow didn't want him there, and she also didn't want him to know that she was in the hospital at all. I don't remember exactly where I read this or heard this, so don't hold me to that, but this is something that I struggle with when we talk about Alexander McQueen and especially Isabella Blow. I will never argue that she didn't help Lee's career or even propel his career forward. She absolutely found him a place in the fashion world, a place where he could belong amongst them. She wore his clothes, she talked about him to the press, she praised his collections any chance she could. But the part I struggle with is the argument that she discovered him, and the fact that she felt she was owed more somehow for having supported his career like any friend would have and should have. I'm really struggling to articulate my thoughts and put them out there right now. I feel a couple things, but let's just get back to the story. Another thing we have to remember is that when you have an addiction, everything else comes second. Mix in the immense guilt Lee felt for his addictions, he was battling a lot, just like Isabella Blow. And that is an incredible amount of guilt to place on one singular person when everyone who knew her knew she was suicidal. There was nothing anyone could do. It was no one's fault. Isabella Blow wanted to die, but that doesn't mean that Lee didn't agree with them. He was fully and despairingly aware that he had broken her heart. And when she died, he said it felt like he had lost a limb. The day of her funeral, you can see the pain he was suffering, the love he had for her through the haunting look on his face as he left.
I saw him at Izzy's funeral, and I've never seen anyone so devastated. Couldn't recognize him. He sat right behind me. But I turned around as a person in the Highland. I thought, my God, it's McQueen, Alexander. And the look on his face was haunting. I felt very sorry for him. We just looked at each other. You know, the person we loved had gone.
Their love affair was over, and Lee was angry at the world. He had lost someone he wasn't able to say goodbye to because he had just kept letting her down. He couldn't forgive himself, and then everything went dark. Lee really struggled with her death, saying, "The reason I got into this business is because I love what I do. After I was at Givenchy, I lost that feeling, but after my friend died, I found a new love for it because she loved it. She found me because of what I was good at. I had to slap myself in the face and say, pull yourself together. This is what you love doing, so do it properly." It was a wake-up call, and I actually do love it more than I ever have.
I have to be honest, the last maybe 5 years, I've been good. There was a period when it wasn't so good and I had a lot of angst, and it was kind of hard. There was a lot of confliction in my head with doing a job that I didn't particularly want to do, which was Givenchy, and then I was, but then my life started to level out, and my work got more and more poetic.
I'm much more relaxed as a person. The Givenchy days, as you know, was quite traumatic. It was a lot of work. I was 26 at the time when I started Givenchy. It was a great experience, but maybe it was for someone so young. I think it was a lot of work to do because I was designing 14 collections a year. It was incredible. I would never go back there. I mean, I would never step back. I'm glad I did.
Yes, of course, it was one step in your way. Yeah,
and I'm glad it was when I was young, and because now it's made me more confident in my own work, and I think I understand more what I'm looking for in my life, in my work.
It seems Lee had found new life, new footing. He even went as far as to visit a psychic to see how Isabella Blow was doing in the afterlife, because he needed to know that she was at peace. And they told him that she was doing well, but she was furious at her husband for moving on with a woman who now wore her clothes. And that was all true. Her husband, Detmar, had moved on, and his partner had moved into her home in the hills only a few months after her passing. And as the conversation progressed, the psychic informed Lee that Isabella Blow had sworn to haunt Hill's house for the next 600 years, and wanted to be remembered as La Dame Bleue. This cathartic conversation launched the most productive and powerful period of Lee's career. His show that October, La Dame Bleue, was made in collaboration with Isabella Blow's other protege, Philip Treacy.
Isabella single-handedly invented Alexander and myself from nowhere with such conviction that we will never experience again. Her belief in you made you be the person you are.
La Dame Bleue was not only dedicated to Isabella Blow, but a tribute to the woman who propelled their careers and the woman who faithfully and blindly supported them. With Lee telling the press it's about her way of thinking, and that way of thinking brought light into fashion. She was a diva in what she wore. The invite for the show was an illustration of Isabella Blow wearing a crown, sitting in a carriage being pulled to heaven by a pair of winged white stallions that were said to represent Lee Alexander McQueen and Philip Treacy. The theme was birds, as Isabella loved them, and the audience couldn't get enough of the details, saying it felt like Isabella Blow had been reborn before their eyes. They could see her wearing the clothes and smell her perfume throughout the room.
A muse is somebody who is a constant source of inspiration through their personality and through some sort of charisma.
I asked her, do you feel let down by fashion? Do you think that contributed to your depression? And she said, no, fashion gave me everything.
Together, Lee and Treacy crafted a mythical figure out of Isabella Blow's being.
It sort of transcended being a fashion show, and everybody was touched.
And at the end of the show, the pair walked out hand in hand and took one final bow. It really felt like Lee had been given a second chance, that his love of fashion was reborn, and he was riding a newfound high. Because after that show, Lee and Annabelle Nielsen took a trip to India, where he was inspired once more. The girl who lived in the tree was inspired by India during the British Raj, when India was under British control, which meant the show was rich in Indian imagery. As well, the show focused around a 600-year-old elm tree that had dominated the backyard of Lee's cottage in Hastings, with Annabelle Nielsen saying there is one place that was Lee's real love, a cottage by the sea with a great giant tree, monolith, a living sculpture. I always called it the witch's cottage, and it was where he imagined the show. So at the center of the stage was a giant elm tree wrapped in white silk tulle.
This is older than the house. This is over 400 years old. It's an elm tree, and we uplight it at night. And it's good inspiration.
Equally inspired, Annabelle Nielsen wrote up a short story around the tree based on a pharaoh girl named Isabel who lived in the tree and had descended to Earth after falling in love with a prince, where she was transformed into a princess and traveled to the end of the world. The show is broken up into 2 segments. For the first half of the show, models embodied the sad, lonely pharaoh girl stuck in the tree. They wore gothic Victorian dresses made entirely in black and white with slim silhouettes and cinched waistlines. While the second half of the show depicted the girl's descent from the tree into a princess. Models wore 50s-inspired couture gowns that were rich in color and made of luxurious fabrics and embellishments. And as we said before, the show was rich in Indian imagery. Lee used India's national bird, the peacock, throughout the show. There were jeweled headdresses, juti slippers, and semi-precious stones from Jaipur. As well, there were clear influences to the British monarchy and military, as the show was inspired by India during the British Raj. Lee joked that he picked the royal theme because, I thought I'll do this thing on the Queen and I'll get the knighthood. I'll become Sir Alexander McQueen. Now, all jokes aside, Alexander McQueen was back and better than ever. Or so it seemed. Lee's next 3 collections would focus on the destruction of humanity, so it doesn't really feel like he was all that optimistic about anything, and if I'm being honest, he wasn't. This sort of feels like a fake it till you make it feeling. His life was actually really falling apart. After Isabella's death, Lee's drug use only amplified, and he became obsessed with the idea of death, researching celebrity suicides and the various methods by which people have committed. He was telling people, as I was powerful in life, I will be a god in death, and gays don't do old. It's like his obsession with death had become his way of coping with grief and his illness. And it's hard to imagine or understand how someone can live with a disease that was often seen as a death sentence, to feel alone knowing the world would keep going, knowing your work would go on without you. It had to feel pointless, meaningless even. And maybe that's why Lee was trying to escape this world's reality into what the world might become for us, the destroyers of the human race. But because of timing, I think I'm going to end part 3 here. You'll see when I post part 4, which I plan to release very soon, why I want to end everything here. There's still so much left to cover, and I kind of want to leave the last 3 collections for the next video because they really round out Lee's career and what his mind was like in those final years. And on that note, as always, I really hope you enjoyed this video. I hope that you're enjoying the series. It truly means a lot to me that anyone watches these videos and takes something away from it. And I know that Lee's life was an incredible one. There's a lot that I've left out just for the sake of the story. So if there's anything that you want to talk about that I haven't brought up or something that you might want me to address in part 4 or in a separate video, let me know and I'll see what I can do. But yeah, I hope to see you for the next video. I hope you have a great rest of your day or night. I'm Lally, and I hope to see you all soon. Bye.
He was making such a statement at the time. He was pushing everything to the edge.